This miniature was primed with Vallejo's black primer, and then an airbrush was used to spray German red primer from below, before spraying Dalerani's peach pink ink from above. If you don't have an airbrush, you can achieve a similar result by dry brushing. In retrospect, I could have just primed with German red before the zenithal peach pink, removing the black primer entirely. For almost all steps from this point on, I'll be mixing in a little bit of Golden's matte medium to any of the paints that I use. I should mention that I'll primarily be using acrylic gouache for most of the work on this miniature, but you could use any acrylic paint you like, as you can achieve similar results following the general steps that'll be shown in this video. This first coat is just a general coverage application, but it's important to note that the paint has been thinned enough that it's semi-transparent, allowing you to still see the difference in tones from the zenithal spray of ink previously. Mixing my base coat color with burnt umber, I thin it to a glaze and build shadows under the legs with 2 to 3 layers. I then add a highlight glaze of a brighter mix to build up highlights, focused on following the musculature of the legs and trying to leave some of the base color in between those large muscle fibers. Initially, I was going to follow a similar approach with the boots, but I ended up putting a good bit more effort into the leather components on the model. But the initial approach remains the same. A base coat of several thin layers, a shade, and then a highlight. The real deviation is that I add an additional highlight layer, focusing on thin hatching lines to create the feel of scratched and worn leather. This was a very slow and tedious process, and I found it important not to get in a hurry. For the coat, I made multiple mistakes, such as base coating with the yellow oxide. I ended up base coating over this with the mix to darken it a bit. It's still very yellow, like Jubilation Lee yellow. But the additional colors I add later will help guide this into more of a tanned beige. As I begin adding the highlight, I thought I'd try adding hatching lines. I thought this was looking terrible, but I continued forward to see what the end result would be, knowing that I could always re-base coat the jacket and not really lose any detail with too many layers of paint, since the jacket was all smooth surfaces. I continue with adding hatching lines, though this time as shadows. I decided to cover the entire coat with the brown wash, and this was stupid. The idea was that it would help blend the color some and then darken it a little. Instead, I should have used a thin speed paint. The wash only made the jacket look extremely dirty and greasy, which would have been fine if he was a hobo living in a post-apocalyptic foundry. But he's a feral killer that would likely be stalking the woods or the streets. And like the hatching lines, I continued on. I would have to fix this one spot, so why not see what it looks like with it all washed, and then fix it all. Once the wash had dried, it left a glossy reflection, so I coated the jacket with anti-shine matte varnish to dull it back down. I then added more shadows using golden sepia thinned with medium. I couldn't remember if this symbol meant transparent or semi-transparent, but a quick search on the Golden website showed it was semi-transparent, so I decided to add a little more medium to make it even thinner. I then applied this as a shade to the leather bits and the jacket. I move on to the furs, which I paint only with hatching lines, first with an off-white, then with a little bit of gray for a shade, and finally with pure white. Like the boots and jacket, all these hatching lines took a very long time, and I gave extra focus on trying to keep them as thin as possible. It is very tedious, but I feel it very much gives you a much more realistic result in the end. The cuffs of the jacket are not textured, but I paint the hatching lines on it in an effort to give the illusion that it was. I kept the flesh simple and followed an approach much like I did with the pants. First with the base coat, a highlight, a shade, and then a final highlight. Each layer was done multiple times with paint thinned to a glaze. This was what he looked like after 2 glazes, and it was at this point that I almost decided to forget about Sabertooth and paint the dark hair and connect his chops with a mustache to honor Motorhead's late Lemmy. Rest in peace, brother. The hair is done with the base coat, a wash, and 2 layer highlights, each covering less area. The final highlight I make sure is much more than just an edge highlight, and that it gets down into many of the crevices so that it is connected. The last thing I did was add a little bit of transparent raw umber ink to the underside of his musculature to tint it a little brown and reduce the starkness as it looked almost black. I didn't buy this transparent ink until after I painted most of this miniature. I realized that I had very few transparent paints and no transparent inks. So I made a special trip and picked up a half dozen bottles to fill this void. And then finish up the base and call it finished. And this is the end result. Something to note is that in the box art, he is painted as if he has a shirt on. Since the shirt's neck falls with the necklace, I instead decided to paint him as if he was shirtless because you can see his belly button. And that had to be a mighty tight shirt in order to see that and the crevices between his abdominal muscles. I'm pleased with how the dark leather boots came out along with how clean the miniature looks in general. I almost added some blood spatter across his hands and torso as well as some of the white fur, but ultimately decided against it. For lessons learned, the jacket didn't come out god-awful in the end, but I definitely made multiple mistakes on it, and I'm damn sure never going to put wash on large flat surfaces like that ever again. Additionally, I was afraid that I had too many brown and yellow colors too close together, with the dark leather, the jacket, his hair, and his flesh all being various shades that weren't far off on the color wheel, but they are easily distinguishable and are believable and aren't an eyesore. I hope you learned something or were inspired to start or expand your own collection of Marvel Crisis Protocol game. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.